Hi, my name is Jenny Boyette, and I'm on staff at North Point Community Church. I get the privilege of helping adults connect into community and assist in the CARE Network in their training events. Today, we are going to have a conversation about two very important topics, depression and suicide. It's a personal topic to me, as several of my own family members have dealt with these issues. You may have been personally affected as well, or know someone who has, because national statistics tell us that 7% of the population had one or more depressive episodes in the past year. 1 out of 20 of those people had thoughts of suicide, and 38,000 people die from suicide every year. Now, you may be wondering, what exactly is depression? Well, according to Webster Dictionary, it is a serious medical condition in which a person feels very sad, hopeless, and unimportant. I'm about to spend the next 40 minutes interviewing 4 people, 2 of which have suffered personally with depression and suicidal thoughts, while 2 others have walked with family members that have suffered. We know this is a big topic, and we are so thankful that you guys are with us today. I want to start by having everybody get to know you. So John, why don't you go first?
My name is John, and I grew up in an awesome household. I have an older brother who was just incredible, and growing up we moved around a lot in the country because my dad worked for the government. We did a lot of moving around, so I had a real happy, awesome, almost leave it to beaver childhood. But then in high school, I started experiencing some emotional swings, some things, and a lot of it we just thought was adolescence, right? But then as I moved into college, it became very clear that I was not well, that I was going into some very serious depressions as well as some manic episodes, to the point where I had come to the point where I had attempted to take my own life, overdosing on medication. And a friend of mine found me, drove me to the hospital, and after 3 weeks in the mental health facility, I was diagnosed with bipolar II, which is a form of manic depression that is very heavy on the depressive side. And so for the past 23 years, I've just spent time trying to learn how to navigate it and work through it, all while being married and having 2 awesome kids. Yeah. So, that's why I'm here.
That's great. I'm Courtney, and I recently graduated college with criminal justice, and I'm currently working in children's ministry, so you can see how those apply. Yeah. And it's kind of similar to you, John. I was diagnosed when I was younger, and so been battling it with bipolar since I was about 12. But then in college is where it really escalated, and I ended up having several suicide attempts, went to several psychiatric units, and eventually ended up in a 2-month treatment facility where I was taught how to cope with what I was experiencing and how to navigate, which I thought was a great word, how to navigate a new normal and how to go the rest of my life with this. So,
well, I'm Justin, and I am married, and I have 3 children I have 2 middle schoolers and a high schooler, and we're just weeks away from having our first driver in the family who is not my wife or I, and recently called the insurance company, and that's why I'm on this panel, because of what it's going to mean. But in actuality, I grew up as the second in a family of 5 children, and my father started showing signs of what would later be diagnosed as depression when he was in graduate school. Only my older sister and I were born at the time. And so pretty much my entire family, my dad's adult life, we've been navigating various intensity levels of depression. And so that's why I'm a part of this panel.
And I'm Suzanne, and my husband's name was Vince, and he was an incredible man in every way. He was outgoing and fun and supportive of everyone else, and it just seemed like he was everybody's favorite person. He was definitely mine. He was a brilliant chef, and he was an instructor at the Culinary Institute of America in New York, and he had a goal of becoming a certified master chef, and that's a very, very intensive test. It's 10 days long, and he prepared for it for 3 years, and he passed the test. He became one of the youngest who had ever passed it, and after that point, rather than being really happy, it seems like that was more stressful. The success of that was more stressful than failure might have been. And he started battling just overwhelming anxiety. His fingers tingled, his heart raced, his mind was negative, and he struggled for about 1.5 years. He cut his wrist, he attempted suicide, and was in the hospital for about 3 weeks. And right when everything seemed to be going our way and our future looked really bright, he shot himself. That was 23 years ago, and it's still very difficult.
Gosh, this is a really big topic and very personal for each of you. So we just really appreciate you spending this time with us so that we can learn and be better equipped to walk with others that we are leading or mentoring. So we just really appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
Let's dive in. Okay, so my first question is going to be for you, Jon and Courtney. What was depression like for you? What did it look like? How did it feel? And what were some symptoms that were pretty obvious to others that you were navigating something serious?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the tricky thing, because I was always able to mask it pretty well. I mean, you get to a point where you can put on a good game face when you're in a crowd. You can force that smile, you can force that joke, you know, all sort of ways to deflect people from actually letting them know what's going on inside of you. But alone, I think some symptoms would be, because I'm naturally sort of gregarious and outgoing, I would withdraw more. I would be absent more often from social gatherings, or if I was in a social gathering, I would become more of a wallflower. Other thing is, I slept a lot. Like, I would sleep 10 to 14 hours a day. And then on top of that, I was easily agitated. I would get really frustrated, really anxious about anything. I mean, down to couldn't tie my shoe right the first time, and it would just infuriate. I mean, I don't know if you had any similar experiences or any ideas like that.
Yeah, I don't know if there's like a specific formula. I feel like everybody kind of deals with depression in different ways. Like, I think media will make it look like maybe your slumped shoulders and can't hold up a spoon, and they're in the dark gray clothing. But I was actually really high active, always going, and that was kind of the problem, is that I always had to have something going. But it was almost like, instead of being depressed, like sleeping for 12 hours, like my mindset was depressed, and so my outlook on life, or the way I saw things, it was almost like this gloom that I couldn't escape from or see it different or find a solution in. That was a problem a lot. I couldn't find any solutions with the problems I was experiencing or the way I was feeling, and that felt isolating. But it was all internal instead of like.
So you're going through the external
symptoms.
motions of life,
Yeah.
but internally your self-talk is very negative.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Totally.
And it was kind of those things where you knock over one thing and it's like just adds on, or
Doom and gloom.
Yeah,
Sure.
And then another thing was just self-deprecation in general. So even if somebody was like, "You did great," I heard, "You didn't do awesome."
So what about you? I know you've walked with your dad, so was it similar to what they experienced? Did you witness that on your side, being a son?
Yeah, well, I mean, my dad started manifesting symptoms when I was really young, like maybe 3 or 4 years old. So in terms of being able to observe a version of him that transformed into a different version, that was something my mom could definitely say she saw. But I think there were things that Jon and Courtney were saying that, as they were speaking, I was like, oh, I've definitely observed, you know, that some of those aspects in my dad. Like, my dad is already introverted, you know, especially when he was going through some intense times. That's when he would be most withdrawn, you know, and most in his internal world. And you could tell he was managing his thoughts at a really high level, and that would make him quieter and quieter and quieter. And I think raising 5 kids who are all fairly close in age, there was a lot of excuse to get irritated.
And so the older you got, was it easier to recognize, the more aware you were of that?
It's funny. I think the more I lived with it, the more it just became the normal operation of our family. And I think I think most people normalize the experience that they grow up in. I think when it would really strike me was when I would be around like a father-son relationship that was like very different and very engaged. So I think I started to, maybe as a young adult, really start to appreciate like the lack of normalcy that was maybe, or maybe there were more effects than I I allowed myself to even understand. So.
Well, there are a lot of misconceptions about depression, and as we've learned, and I'm sure you've learned navigating this, tell us some of those and some things that you could share from your experience that you've heard and seen that could help us.
I think one of the biggest misunderstandings is that depression, bipolar, this is a physical illness. It is an illness that is affecting the neurotransmitters in the brain, dopamine levels, all those funky words, right? That has created a chemical imbalance that results in this odd behavior. And that it, just like any other illness out there, it's something that's diagnosed, it's something that is treated medically. It isn't something that you can just will away with the right thinking, or just choose to cheer up, or if you're manic, choose to calm down. Right. It is something that is physically happening to you, just like any other illness. It's like an insulin level.
Right.
It has to be regulated. So whether it's situational that's put you there, or whether it's clinical that's put you there, the biggest misconception is, I'm just going to talk to you and give you words to say. You just need to think differently.
And like Jon was saying, it doesn't really matter if it's circumstantial, medical, clinical, unless you're a counselor or a psychiatrist who need to find treatment for it. Either if somebody's feeling depression, they're feeling depression, and that should be kind of our main concern. But as far as misconceptions, I've had spiritual misconceptions as well, where just the renewing your mind aspect, or praying through like depression or the cheer-ups. It's not that those things aren't true, it's just they're sometimes not accessible. So there was actually this one time I was really trying to renew my mind, and I was driving. It was kind of a longer drive, and so those times where you try to think while driving. And so I was trying so hard to renew my mind, and that really wasn't working. It wasn't changing my thought patterns. It wasn't changing like the self-deprecation or any of the depressed thought processes I was having. And so I was like, okay, worship music, like that's the next step. So I turned on like worship music, and it was just playing loud, and it really wasn't working either. And at some point during the trip, I just punched the stereo as hard as I could because I was so mad that the worship songs and the renewing of my mind weren't helping me. And I ended up punching the windshield and then swerving off the road just because I was so angry that it wasn't working. And I thought I must have been doing it wrong. But the more I've looked into it, it wasn't that I was doing it wrong. It was that those weren't the ways that God was going to help me through that experience. I think He helps us through depression, and I totally think that sometimes truth is one of them. But in my own walk, I've noticed it's been in the form of doctors or a hand on your back or somebody you needed to speak to that day. It wasn't always just truth in words as the way that God helped me through something. And so I think that's what we rely on the most with depression, is having the perfect thing to say to help someone get out of how they're feeling, or to cheer up, or not to be feeling those things. But I don't think that truth is always the way that depressed people hear God. I think He works in a lot of different ways. And most of mine, it was like medication or doctors or hospitals I stayed at, or just people who loved on me and were there through every single trial, not just spat truth at me all the time.
I love that.
You know, and I think, you know, it's funny you say that. I think there's, at least I grew up in a particular stream of Christianity that had a hard time accepting sort of mental illness as clinical. You know, and one of the things about diabetes, or the other things we're comparing it to, is there's an acceptance we have
so true. That
is sort of like, hey, that's a medical condition, there's science that's uncovered that. And I think brain science is a very young science. Yeah. And so, especially 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when my dad was first struggling with it, I think there was just a reluctance, at least in the spiritual community I was in, to assign it any kind of medical because it was in the mind and because it was being described as a way of thinking, the approach was, well, there must be a spiritual remedy to this. So it wasn't treated like other medical conditions, and there was even a reluctance, I think, on the part of some people in the community I was in to even open that door. And I think I saw a lot of people suffer greatly because they would not even embrace the medical part of it. Because at the time, and keep in mind, this is like 30 years ago, the science of this was emerging. I mean, there was a secular community that was embracing it, but in the spiritual community, there was a little bit of lag there, at least in what I was experiencing. So, like, I think we're now understanding the brain more and more, and I think it's sort of catching up with, as John's describing, the levels in the brain being measured and so forth. You know, that's relatively new science to us. So.
Well, and even people that experience it are still suffering in silence because of the stigma and because of people judging or not knowing what to do. So it still happens.
And I think a major thing that's kind of really difficult about this is that a lot of the times while you're younger, you don't really know that this is what's wrong with you. Right. And so the answer really is renew your mind, replace it with truth, like pray through it. And so you're like, okay, this is what you do for these things. And you don't know that what you're feeling is abnormal, kind of how you said, that feels like a different world. Yeah. So you don't know that your normal is not somebody else's normal.
True.
Yeah. And so you're experiencing adolescence, and those are kind of the answers people are saying. And so you're trying them and trying them and trying them. And when they're not working, you feel like you're failing at it. Not that, like, it's not the answer, but that you're doing it wrong, or you're not successful in the way you pray. Or
you had mentioned earlier too that culture has a certain idea of what it's supposed to look like, that your shoulders are hunched and you're dragging around sleeping a lot, and that wasn't the case for Vince. I think his was more situational, that it was such a prolonged stress that I think it really affected his chemistry, and nobody knew that he was going through it except for me, because he was everybody's support, everybody's strength. He was always upbeat. He was the one that was encouraging. He was the one that was achieving things that other people had not achieved yet. So they could never have understood that he was going through that. He was not the picture of what I see in the commercials. You know, it was different. So that can be confusing.
I think it's the hardest thing about it, that it isn't a formula.
One of the things that's interesting is I feel like where some of the misconceptions can come from is actually not in necessarily how different what you describe sounds like, but actually how familiar it is. Because, for example, you know, when you describe negative self-talk, like, almost everybody can relate to that, because it's like, well, I can relate to that. Yeah. Why, when I go through that, this is what I do to get out of it. Right. You know what I mean? Right. So there's enough common ground there to actually, no, it's not. I understand that you have negative self-talk too, but this is different.
So how should we respond as leaders when someone shares depressive thoughts or feelings? Courtney, what do you think about that?
I think the most common response that people tend to gravitate towards is trying to fix the person, or treating them almost like a project. Or sometimes people try to Band-Aid depression a little bit, like it'll be all right, like God's got a plan, just little fixes, like just be happy, life will work out, just little fixes to get them through it, almost as like a Band-Aid, when really it's such a bigger issue than that little statement could fix.
I think that can be our go-to as Christians and as leaders anyway, to phrases like, God's not going to give you more than you can handle, which is such an inaccurate phrase. Unhelpful and inaccurate, but we want to fix it, we want to make it all better, and sometimes just being with the person and asking great questions is a better response than feeling like you have all these little snippets that are going to be just the right little nugget that's going to sink in.
Definitely. The people I always came back to were the people that sought to understand it instead of fix it or replace it or
even
have
empathy,
the answer.
Right?
Empathy.
Even if you can't understand it, trying to understand it.
And then just walked with me, because people go through it either way. It's just how we respond is going to determine whether or not we go through it alone.
We've been talking a lot about depression, but let's shift, and I want to ask you, Susanne, what are some of the misconceptions of suicide or suicidal thoughts? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
I think we can assume, especially when we see commercials or in culture, that we think that someone who would be suicidal are the ones that are very sad, sleeping too much, dragging around, not able to go to work, not able to function, that those are the people that follow through and commit suicide. But in our situation, that was not the case with Vince. He was very high achieving, very high functioning, did not give the appearance on the outside that he was sad. It was a surprise to everyone. So if we make the assumption that someone has to look a certain way if they are suicidal or they're depressed. For example, to this day, I don't know that I would say that he was depressed. Maybe that all falls under the umbrella, anxiety does, of depression, but that was not something that I was clued into. So if you only think people who are exhibiting such signs would follow through, that would be a misconception and miss it.
Courtney, what about yourself? What thoughts do you have on that?
I think that a lot of people believe that suicidal thinking or suicidal attempts can be explained as somebody who's selfish or weak. And that's one I've heard the most common, really. And I think that it's a distorted view of thinking because I think the strongest people, and this may sound a little weird, but like the strongest people are the ones that actually go and attempt. Because if you think about it, for somebody who's struggling with suicidal ideation, it's not that it's the easy way out. It seems like it's the only way out. And for it to be the only way out, it's actually a very despairing thought to think about, as that's your only way out, especially when you start thinking of the ways to accomplish that. That doesn't represent somebody who's weak who then goes and does that. And a lot of the times it doesn't represent somebody who's selfish, because a lot of those thought processes are around the world will be better off. My loved ones will be better off. They won't have to worry about me anymore. I'm just a burden to them because I'm always sad, or I'm bringing them down, or like I must have been made wrong. And so,
and I can say for anyone who thinks that, that it's not the truth. It's not the truth that the world or your family or your friends would be better off without you, because I'm not better off. And because the world needed Vince, and there was nobody else like Vince. And that's the same for each one of us. We're unique, and we were put here for a reason. So I don't know what the best thing to say to help someone move out of that mindset, but I can say it is not the truth. Your family and friends are not better off.
No, absolutely.
So I'd like to revisit what it's like to live with someone that is struggling with suicide and depression. Susanne, can you walk us through some of that again?
I think one thing that was so hard was it was so different than our life had been before when he started battling the anxiety. And I lived in a lot of fear. I felt like it was my responsibility to keep him alive. And that takes a toll. You know, I felt like if I weren't in the right place at the right time or didn't say the right thing, that it wouldn't be enough. And I really appreciated how much, though, that he shared with me of how much he was hurting, what he was thinking, and what he was feeling. And I believed him, and I wasn't impatient with him. I wasn't frustrated. I didn't want to say, you know, you've got to figure this out. I just hurt for him, and I wanted not to carry it on my own, but counseling and medication wasn't so helpful for him. So very often I did feel like that it was all on my shoulders. And I do think there are times that he would have done it earlier if I hadn't said the right thing or been in the right place. I would say during that time, I probably was growing more spiritually, and he was too. There was prayer that helped, there was scripture that helped, sermons that we would listen to. Yet it was very discouraging when we were just crying out to God to take this away, and when it didn't seem like he did, just to try to understand why. And I still don't have answers, because I think messes me up, you know, in some ways, to say, what would I even pray for now? You didn't answer that prayer as I thought you should have. So
it's hard.
Yeah.
It's a hard position to walk with someone you love that's struggling in this. All right, so what were some of the symptoms that you guys experienced as you were contemplating suicide? Help us learn and understand what you're thinking.
You know, the self-berating becomes incessant. It's non-stop, and it's usually, mostly for me, it was internalized. It was the, you know, you're no good for this, you know, you're no good at that. But then eventually I would start saying things like, you know, what am I really doing here? I'm not really offering up anything or providing anything. I don't even know what I'm doing. Like, those generalized things were actually specifically about my life in general, or in specific.
Not your major,
not
or
my
your
major,
career.
not the location I was in, but they were real easy clues to sift over, you know, especially with somebody who has a self-deprecating sense of humor like myself. So people are like, yeah, come on, Jon, you're worth something. You know you're worth stuff. But the more I would say that, I think would have been, and if had anybody understood what was going on, I think those would have been more. He really doesn't know why he's here on this earth anymore. He's literally questioning his own existence out loud. That's a great symptom. So little questions like that maybe aren't, you know, I'm not going to come out and say, I really want to kill myself. I'm going to come out and say, I just don't know why I'm here.
All right, so as someone who has family members, myself, that struggle with depression, I would love to hear some suggestions and advice on self-care so that I'm better equipped and prepared to walk with them. What is some advice that you could give us?
So what I would say is in a couple of things, and obviously Suzanne's going to weigh in on this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, but you know, there's obviously a need for community in all of these type of situations, and I think that what that looks like is people in your life that are not afraid to ask you about the situation in sincerity. Because when you deal with this condition in an ongoing way, and the weight of a loved one who may or may not be experiencing an episode that's so intense, they might take their life. That is not something that's like, hey, how's your dad doing?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like that question's gonna get, yeah, he's okay now, or he's not going through a good time or whatever. But I think what there's probably more of a need for, and it was really an unpacking of like, what's it like for you to be dealing with this week in and week out, day in and day out? And I think there's just a need to unload that. And that isn't like, you know, we always have to avoid in those moments the tendency we have to give advice, or when we hear something we think would be helpful, it's like, you know, I found out a clinic that would be great, and what people don't realize is how many of those things have been tried, or, you know, I have this great psychiatrist that you know need to see, which those are all well-meaning things, you know, but if you can just be present and curious and sincere in your desire to hear, realizing that the care that you're providing that person is really what you're providing them is a chance to unload some of their emotional burden that they probably don't have a whole lot of safe places to do that with.
But I think that you need a healthy combination of community, of your family and friends who know and love you, and they've been tracking along. But I think you also need your own counseling. You need an objective person that you don't feel like you're weighing them down by telling them one more hard thing, that they understand, and that they're a professional, so that they have some very wise counsel on that. For me too, it was very helpful to have some of my own interest. I rode horses every day, and just to be able to get away and not be carrying that 24 hours a day, but to have a little bit of another outlet was very helpful for me.
And I think Suzanne's point about having an external trained expert counselor is a helpful one. I mean, I don't know how someone suggests that to someone who's not open to it, but you know, eventually I found my way into that relationship as well. And it was in a relationship with a counselor that I was told something that I think was one of the most helpful things, and that was, you know, Justin, you got to be careful not to pick up things that don't belong to you. And that was in the context of, it is not your dad's responsibility, your dad's life is not in your hands. Your dad's choices are not your responsibility. And I don't really think I think that idea of being able to lay down the idea that this person belongs to God, their choices are between ultimately them and the Lord, and that I am not the one that was designed to carry that weight, was really the idea of, don't pick up what doesn't belong to you. You were never designed to carry that. I think that was a very, very freeing idea that probably wouldn't have come in a family relationship or in a community group, you know. But it was somebody who knew the whole idea and was trained professionally, that sort of said, I can see what's going on here, and let me just give you a little idea that might unlock something that would be healthy for you. So I do think it's sort of a plurality of helpful.
Well, and knowing that it's not in your hands, but believing it is, it's hard. It's a really hard spot to be in. All right, so we've been talking a lot, but I would love to know some of the practical do's and don'ts with depression and suicide. Jon, start us off.
I think the terms to walk with and to be with are the biggest things. That is a definite do. I want to know that somebody is there. I don't necessarily want somebody in there providing answers, trying to fix it. I just want to feel somebody else's presence, because that's the one thing that's missing in the midst of a depression. And I also want somebody to listen if I want to speak. I mean, listening is huge. Listening without responding is huge, so that I feel like sometimes my words can help me unload this thing that I'm feeling, just getting it out of my mouth. It's very interesting. Now, what not to do is what I experienced when I was in the mental health facility during my college times. There was an organization on campus that was a Christian organization, and they're a great organization, but some representatives from that organization came to visit me in the mental health facility, which I thought was great. And they were very sweet, very kind, very proper, and proceeded to tell me that they were really concerned that my lack of faith had brought me there. Wow. So don't ever do that. You know, I was a brand new Christian. I was literally a Christian, much like I was a Christian maybe only a year. And that moment could have derailed.
How did it not derail you?
This is a great story. My pastor at the time came to visit me right after this organization did. And in not so many words, he told me to not listen to a bleep word they said.
Awesome. That helped. What great timing.
And the swear word worked really well for some odd reason, because that mimicked how I was feeling towards what they said to me. But at the same time, I felt great comfort that he would say that he gave me the permission to go, listen, we're going to work through what's going on right now. I just thought it was amazing. Yeah.
That's good. Courtney, do's and don'ts that you would give me and our audience.
Yeah, I feel like we've covered it a little bit, but just the best thing anybody has ever done for me is just listening and seeking to understand. I think that when you're in that slipping point, that's when you cling on to those truths, just like anybody would in their day-to-day lives, where you replace lies with truth. Because otherwise you're going to let the lies consume you. And that's true of a depressed mind, and that's true of a normal mind. I think the difference is when you're in that depression or you're in that suicidal thinking, those truths are hard to see, and they're hard to cling on to, because all you see is hopelessness. And kind of what I was saying about no solutions, they don't seem like tangible solutions. They just seem like what you want to be true, like you want God to love you, but you don't feel it at all. You want to feel hope, but you just feel despair. And so they end up being more of a guilt thing, because you feel this pressure to feel those positive things and to feel those hope, but all you feel is just isolation. And so as I've been slipping, it was definitely something that kept me from going down there. It was just replacing those truths. But in the midst of a crisis, it ended up being actually more hurtful and more frustrating that I couldn't access them. And it took me a long time to realize that, because I placed blame on God for that. I was like, I'm in this deep hole and I've spiraled down here, and everybody said that if I replaced these lies with truth, you would pull me out and you would rescue me, and that you would keep me from feeling those things. But when I didn't feel that and I was still in that spot, I felt like either God was rejecting me or he didn't want me or I wasn't doing it right. And so it took me a while to realize that God's form of rescue isn't always through the voice of truth or scripture from somebody. It could be an action or a hand on your back, or in my case, it was a lot of doctors who figured out the right medications for me, or when I went into the rehab program, how the body of Christ just surrounded me. And it was their actions that I saw that I knew it was God loving me through every one of those trials, even if it wasn't the perfect things anybody said. I don't remember one perfect thing anybody said, but I remember someone bringing a Christmas tree to the rehab program during Christmas, and I remember people lying in hospital beds with me, but it wasn't usually something perfectly crafted that was a verse.
I really think it's important to believe someone when they tell you that they're hurting, that they have no hope, that they want to hurt themselves, that they don't want to live, that they have nothing to live for. Believe them.
Yeah.
You need to believe them, and that might make it feel like the next move on your part is such a huge responsibility, but you don't have to take on that as a responsibility all on yourself. At the church where you go, there are staff who are trained to help them find some next steps. So you can calm the person, you can ask them good questions, you can listen well and seek to understand, but to know that you have a team behind you that will help them get counseling, help them have resources, and help them have a professionally trained person that they can connect with to take some next.
And believing them is the first part of that, to then get them those resources.
I think there are definitely some things that are not helpful that you can say. It's not helpful to say, you don't really want to die, or why would you be so selfish, or there are a lot of people that have a lot of worse things going on than you do. They're already feeling the shame and the embarrassment. They're already feeling that. So by saying those things, it just heaps that much more on them. We had touched on before about over-spiritualizing. I really think that God can do anything. I think that prayer is powerful. I think that his word is true. But these little phrases that you're just going to plunk in that, or a little verse that you're going to send off and think that that's going to resolve everything, doesn't feel great when it's received. So
it probably doesn't feel great for the person, or you're the loved one walking with them. So someone giving that to you or to Vince would have been very discouraging instead of helpful. So we've talked about the power of someone's presence with you when you're in one of those states that is spiraling, like you've talked about. Do you have an example, Jon, of a time that really happened in your life that's very practical?
Yeah, this was about, I'm thinking, this is about a year after I got out of the mental health facility. I was living back at my house. I was seeing a psychiatrist pretty regularly, well, very regularly, psychologist, and they were trying to find the medication that would stabilize me, basically. I was swinging pretty radically from a hypomanic state to a severe depressed state. And in the middle of those swings, I would be very angry, very agitated. It was just this roller coaster of emotion that was going on in my mind and my body. And so I very vividly remember this one moment in my family room at my parents' house, where I don't know what I was so upset about, but I started to throw things, I managed to pick up my father's like lazy boy, like it was like superhuman strength, right? and was throwing it and attempting to throw it out the window and was just losing control. And my mom, who's very sweet and very proper as well, she comes out of nowhere and she just, excuse me, she tackles me. And she doesn't yell at me like, "What are you doing? Stop it." She doesn't do anything like that. She tackles me, and she holds me on the ground as I'm fighting her. And all she says over and over again for like 30 minutes is, "I love you. I love you. I love you. I love you." And about 30 minutes later, whatever that contact was, whatever that will she had to not give up on me, eventually brought me down and calmed me down. And that was one of those being there moments. I'm not saying as a mentor or a leader, you're going to be tackling people, but she was just there.
But the power of that presence and that unconditional love or acceptance.
I will never forget it. And it's one of those things that can still carry me through. When I'm sliding down now, I can still recall that moment, knowing how much my mom loved me. And it's just, it will never leave me, ever. So when I think about that happening with my mom, nowadays, I look at that and I think that was such an awesome physical reminder of God's love for me, that as I'm careening around, and not to over-spiritualize, but as I am up and down emotionally and all over the place and feeling this hopelessness or feeling this escape from hopelessness, that I felt like, I look back on that moment and I think that God is just, it is a great physical reminder that God, no matter where I am, is, holding on to me with all of his strength. And that's a great sort of, that came later as I was renewing my mind, how that picture, that physical act that my mom did is really what's happening to me with my Heavenly Father, every moment, every day when I'm walking through this and trying to navigate these pitfalls of this illness. So.
What a beautiful picture.
Yeah.
We hope this conversation provides you with practical information to assist you as you walk with people, whether family members, friends, or those you lead and mentor. Thank you for listening today. And if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to a church staff member or a local licensed counselor to continue this conversation.